Hello and welcome to the World Deciphered, brought to you by the Cipher Brief. I'm your host, Cipher Brief CEO and publisher Suzanne Kelly. In the aftermath of a stunning takeover of Syria by rebel groups, who stands to win and who stands to lose the most in the region? As we start to see signs of what a new government in Damascus could look like, we're also starting to see the ripple effects of who might be losing influence in the region. Satellite images of the military port of Tartus, a port leased by Russia, show that naval activity there has halted, and images credited to Maxar Technologies by the New York Times appear to show that Russian ships have moved out. Tartus was Russia's only port in the Mediterranean. And what about Turkey's role in the taking of Damascus? We're talking with two former senior CIA officers with deep experience in the region about what Turkey's tacit approval for the rebel overthrow could signal. Plus, protesters have been on the streets of Tbilisi for more than 2 weeks now, braving brutal police crackdowns. But these streets may also be the latest front line in Vladimir Putin's efforts to extend Russian influence and reimpose Moscow's authority on nations that were once part of the Soviet Empire. We're talking with Cipher Brief international correspondent Meurmishvili on the impact of the protests. And a report from the streets of Vilnius, Lithuania, where Cipher Brief expert and former senior CIA officer Ralph Goff gives us the latest on fears that Russian influence will continue to spread. But first, let's check in with Cipher Brief managing editor Tom Nagorski in New York for more on the takeover of Syria. Tom?
Suzanne, we're focused almost exclusively this week on the incredible news from Syria. The Assad regime has been overthrown. A coalition of rebels captured Damascus on Sunday, the last stop on their stunningly fast rebellion. And Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator, has fled to Russia, where he's apparently been given asylum. Assad ruled Syria with an iron fist for more than 2 decades, his father for 3 decades before that. The rebellion lasted all of 10 days. And now the questions are really all about what happens now that that iron fist is gone. The rebels say they have begun the work of turning over power to a transition government, and the prime minister says he's working with them to do that. Those are, of course, good signs. One of the first things the rebels did in Damascus was to free prisoners from at least one of the jails that was notorious for the abuse of dissidents. We've seen remarkable scenes of celebration in the capital and other parts of the country. But as you know, Suzanne, this is a fragile moment. Syria is a country with multiple different factions and outside influences, and of course it sits at the heart of the Middle East, and wars are raging not far from Damascus. The rebel coalition itself is a question mark. It's led by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, which was a jihadist group that landed on the State Department terrorist list. HDS says it dropped its ties to terrorists years ago and has been interested only in bringing an end to, quote, the rule of the tyrant, unquote. Other questions will involve other countries. Iran was a key ally of Assad's, and now we've seen Iranian military and diplomatic personnel fleeing the country. Russia was another ally. It has air and naval bases in Syria. The relationship with Turkey has been complicated. And Israel has already attacked military sites in Syria, saying they're worried about heavy weapons falling into the hands of militant groups. And as for the United States, officials have expressed cautious optimism. No tears for Assad, they say, but concerns about what may follow. And that really is the overriding question for Syria right now. Joy in the streets and among many Syrian communities all over the world over a day they thought might never come. But no illusions about how messy things might get in the days ahead. Back to you, Suzanne.
All right. Thanks, Tom. Let's dig in now on the implications of this takeover that aren't necessarily making the headlines. The cost for the regime of former President Bashar al-Assad is pretty clear. But what about the cost to his supporters, namely Russia and Iran? The World Deciphered spoke this week with former senior CIA officer and Cipher Brief expert Glenn Korn about that.
Putin's in a very bad position because he was unable to support his proxy, his ally, although he claimed for years, he would never abandon any of the people he has relationships with or supports. So it was the next best thing, I think, for Putin. He had no choice. He had to take him in Moscow because he had to show that he wasn't going to throw him. He wasn't going to do what we did to the Shah when he fled Iran, if you remember, in the 1970s. And, he has been a loyal partner, I guess, to Moscow to some degree. And I'm sure he preferred living in Russia to Iran, given his
You know,
lifestyle.
let's talk a little bit about how you think this may have strengthened Turkey. Obviously, Turkey had to give its tacit approval, at least, if not played a bigger role in this, as they control those northern territories where this all started. How are you thinking about Turkey's role in this, Glenn?
Well, I think that the Turks played a major role because they never abandoned the Syrian opposition. They've maintained relations. They've provided assistance. They've kept a steady hand. If you saw the first comments Giuliani made when he went into Aleppo, they were very moderate comments, an appeal to the international community and the community inside of Syria, basically trying to say that I'm no longer, I'm not an extremist. We're not going to be extremists. We're not going to go after religious minorities or, other ethnic groups. We'll see if he can live up to that, but I'm sure that the Turks had a hand in managing that marketing package. This is a big win for Turkey in one way because a lot of Syrian refugees can return. There's a lot of pressure, on the Turkish government, the number of Syrian refugees, the largest number in the world. The largest number per capita is in Lebanon, but the largest number was in Turkey, which was a big political issue and pressure on the economy of Turkey. Now they can start returning home. Of course, the Russians had been able to blackmail Ankara for years by using Idlib and the threat of more waves of refugees. That has been reduced or eliminated, at least temporarily. It gives the Turks probably some advantage because they're in a key position and they're probably going to use that to negotiate things they want with other players, including the U.S., the Russians. My understanding is there are negotiations ongoing, according to the media reporting, with the Russians about their bases in Latakia, Tartus, and how they're going to either retrograde or whether they're going to stay there at all. And the Turks are kind of key right now, given their relationship with HTS and the SNA. And then, finally, I think that there are some threats to Turkey, too. This could turn into, and for everybody in the region, all the border countries are concerned that the groups that are now behaving moderately could go back to their old ways, or some of them at least, which would mean a return to the behavior of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, other extremist groups, which is obviously of concern to everybody on the borders.
Yeah, it's interesting to get your perspective on that, Glenn. Let's go back to Russia for just a moment. What will be some of the indicators that you'll be looking for that Russia is going to completely pull out of Syria and disengage there now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, if you have the assets, you're looking at all the movements by their facilities, the bases, transportation, the negotiations with the Turks, with the new Syrian regime, whatever the form of that regime is going to be. The Russians are scrambling right now to put out statements that everything is fine around their bases, that there have been there's no threats. They're on full alert, but everything is fine. There's conflicting reporting. There was reporting yesterday, I think, from the Ukrainian sources claiming that the Russians were withdrawing their equipment from Tartus. They were already in retrograde. I don't know if that's true or not. There's reporting that the Russians are in negotiations about finding routes to remove their equipment, and that would be, with Turkish help. So again, Turkey's in a key position here. We should remind the listeners, the viewers, that because of the Montreux Treaty and Turkey's enforcement of that treaty, the Russians were not going to be able to move their naval vessels through the Bosphorus. That is closed to military transportation. And so they're going to have to go around, either through the Baltic or through the Pacific to get home. Because I don't think there's anywhere else for them to go in the Mediterranean unless they strike a deal with somebody else. And they are trying, for example, in Sudan and some other places. But so it's a very, very interesting situation. But I think that for the near term, it's a clear sign that the Russians are not going to be able to use those facilities like they were doing before. I highly doubt that the Syrian opposition, or now whatever provisional government comes into power, is going to allow Moscow to use their aircraft to bomb Sunnis, hospitals, civilians, which they were doing long before they started their attacks in Ukraine, which many people in the West didn't pay much attention to, but it's a fact. They were terrorizing the Syrians on behalf of Assad and together with Assad by going after civilian targets. in a very cynical way. I doubt they're going to be able to keep doing that.
Another angle to this story that we're tracking is stringing together the series of events from Syria to Georgia to Romania, where Russian influence is under pressure. While experts see Russian President Vladimir Putin's inability to protect the Assad regime as a sign of Moscow's limits, there is one area where Moscow is feeling an advantage, and that's where it comes to information operations. We'll get a report now on how that's playing out in the streets of Tbilisi in just one moment. But first, it's worth noting that Romania actually took the unprecedented step of annulling the first round of voting results, citing declassified intelligence that foreign-backed social media campaigns influenced the result. For more on Russia's hand and how it's playing out throughout the region, and to help put all of this into some broader context, we spoke with Cipher Brief expert and former senior CIA officer Ed Bogan in Washington about Russia's position in the region.
Yeah, I think they're very stretched, and what they can't afford to lose is the power of their information operations, because they seem to be incredible catalysts for setting conditions in their favor or disrupting conditions that are against their favor, right? So it's a sort of double-edged sword. And, Romania is interesting. Romania is very interesting because you have a constitutional court saying, hey, we're nullifying this election. We need to do this again. We have intelligence that identifies that there was an operation here to influence the outcome. And we had a fairly anomalous, surprising result. And we're going to effectively run this again. Now, let's see how that goes, because the information space is what it is, and it's heavily contested, it's heavily polluted, and it's heavily influential. And so this, to me, that was fascinating to see that a constitutional court said, "Hey, we're gonna stop this." Yeah. One of the things that I think we all see quite often is that our adversaries use our freedom kind of against us, and that's one space where it's effective, whether it's information operations online and influence operations. But then, what does it undermine? It undermines rule of law. Well, rule of law just came back and said in Romania, "Hey, let's make sure what we're doing here is actually legitimate." Mm-hmm. So to me, that's important, and it's an indicator of how stretched Russia is right now. Looking at something more tangibly than in the information space is looking at the naval base in Syria. Tartus is an incredibly important naval base for Russia. Several years ago, I knew it was the most heavily used port by Russian military ships outside of Russia. That became particularly important after Cyprus banned Russian military ships from Limassol in 2022. And if they lose that port, which I would probably put money on it at this point that they're going to, that has an incredible impact for them, because they use that not just for Syria operations, they use that for support to Libya operations. That's also, they're when they show a show of force in the Mediterranean, like this is central. I mean, it's where they refuel, it's where they get food for the teams that are going to be on those ships for extended deployments. So there's a lot to watch in the Russia space right now. They're definitely under strain. We saw today the Syrian embassy in Moscow started flying the flag of the opposition, even though they also took Assad in the last 24 hours. And it's because is it some kind of compromise? Like, they're obviously having dialogue and trying to figure out almost certainly, how do we keep our bases? Yeah. There's two bases, but the port's crucial.
When we come back, protests in Georgia are testing the limits of the country's political future. What is Russia's hand there? We're talking with Cipher Brief international correspondent Meurmishvili after the break.
You probably already know that the Cipher Brief works with deeply experienced experts on global and national security to help put context around today's headlines. But did you also know that the Cipher Brief produces a daily report that keeps you up to speed on national and global security stories that are impacting businesses around the world? Like the President's Daily Brief, the Cipher Brief's open source report should be your first read of the day to stay ahead of the national and global security stories impacting your world. Become a subscriber and get the report for free. Subscribe at thecipherbrief.com.
Welcome back to the World Deciphered. The situation in Georgia remains tense as political protests lead into a third week. I spoke with Cipher Brief international correspondent Meurmishvili, who is from Georgia, to get a sense of the broader impact of what's happening there.
Protesters have been out nonstop, day and out, for this past few days. Basically, starting from November 29th, a day after the Prime Minister announced that Georgia was halting its European aspirations for 4 years. The Prime Minister said that the government will not pursue any European integration measures until 2028. And that really caused the turmoil in the country. And mind you, just a month before that, Georgia had very contested parliamentary elections that have not been recognized by any of Georgia's Western partners, including the United States, the EU. OSCE has not published its report. So with this sort of background, election or contested election background, a month after that, Prime Minister basically comes out and says that Georgia is changing its foreign policy orientation. That generated a tremendous anger, especially in the young people. So they are the ones who are still out in the streets of Tbilisi, and some 43 other cities and villages in the country. So it's unprecedented for Georgia to have the entire country basically demonstrating. Now, how this can evolve and where this can go, that's nobody knows really. The government is pursuing this tactic to get the demonstrators tired, get them exhausted. It's cold in Georgia right now, so the government riot police is using water cannons, pepper spray, and in the cold weather, getting soaked by the water cannon is not a pleasant thing, I would imagine. So some of these tactics are probably meant to wear them down and get them tired, but the demonstrators don't seem to be affected by this. On the demonstrator side, they are demanding that unless the government calls for new elections to re-elect a different parliament, to have a government, and according to, this is maybe a bit too nuanced, but according to the Georgian constitution, after this parliamentary elections, Georgia was supposed to change into a Republican or the fully representative republic. So the parliament would elect the prime minister and parliament would elect the president. So that's why these elections were very important, and that's why the demonstrators are asking or demanding new elections. So if there is a new parliament in the country, not the one that's contested and disputed and dominated by the ruling Georgian party, but the coalition government, then Georgia still has a chance to continue its path to the EU.
Yeah, a critical time, obviously, in Georgia politically. What has the U.S. position been so far, and what do you think Georgians expect or would want to see from the United States?
The U.S. has been a strategic partner for Georgia, or U.S.-Georgia have had strategic partnership since 2009, I believe. So for Georgia, that's been an independent country for 30 years. That's a very long strategic partnership with the United States. And this partnership just recently stopped. About a month ago, less than a month ago, U.S. announced that it's stopping strategic partnership with Georgia as a result of this policy review announcement that Secretary Blinken made sometimes this March of this year. So over time, the U.S. has been signaling the Georgian Dream government that we're not very happy the way our relationship and partnership is evolving. Maybe we should do something about it. And in response, the Georgian Dream government has been nothing but insulting and rejecting all these overtures from Washington. Georgian government has been very dismissive and very insulting towards U.S. ambassador to Georgia, both the previous ambassador and the current one as well. And then the government and the parliament approved the so-called foreign agent law this spring in March of this year, which was a really big red flag for the U.S., not only just the U.S. government, but everybody in the West, the EU, the individual European countries. So that's when the U.S. government announced this policy review towards Georgia, and they've sanctioned 4 individual judges and people related to the justice system. They've also introduced travel restrictions or visa restrictions for some of the individuals who are involved in efforts to derail Georgian democracy. And now there's a big expectation from everybody in Georgia, both the government, I must say, and the opposition, that U.S. will announce personal financial sanctions against, in particular, the richest person in the country, Bidzina Ivanishvili, who made his billions in Russia in the 1990s. And he's basically the kingmaker in the country. He's appointing prime ministers. He rules the country from behind the curtains without having any public accountability. So U.S. has been involved. Long story short, U.S. has been very closely involved, and still many people in Georgia are relying on the United States coming out, potentially even maybe this week, and saying that the U.S. will financially sanction all involved in using force against the demonstrators and basically derailing Georgia's democracy.
Yeah, you know Georgia better than most people. As a final question, I just want to ask you, when we're thinking about Russian influence in Georgia and in the region, what do you think the opportunities will be with a new U.S. administration coming in to power in January? What do you think the opportunities will be to counter the Russian influence that is so pervasive in the entire region, not just Georgia?
I think this period presents a tremendous opportunity for anything democracy, Western values related, against what Russia is trying to push out in the region. So in this past month, it's very also important for us and our viewers to remember what happened as it comes to Russia's influence in the region in this past month. Syria, as we saw, is Russia basically lost Syria, and together with Syria, potentially even Eastern Mediterranean. So we'll see how that goes, but Russia definitely has a weakened position in that region. We saw what happened in Moldova with all of its hybrid efforts that Russia used before or in the lead up to the Moldovan election. Even on the day of the election, pro-European forces won in Moldova. Moldova still has parliamentary elections coming up in April, so we'll see how that goes. But at least thus far, Russia was pushed back in Moldova. And we're seeing what's happening in Romania. Romania is also very important, given the fact that Russia and potentially China tried very hard to have this candidate emerge and be the lead and potentially be elected as the president of the country, who eventually did not make it. The Supreme Court basically annulled the results of the first round in which the Russia-supported candidate was winning. So that's another loss for Russia. Now all eyes are on Georgia in this regard, to be honest, because everything is done by the Russian playbook in Georgia. The way the law enforcement is using force, the way they're against the demonstrators, the way they are arresting people, the methods they are using to frighten the youth, to control some of the elites of the country, exactly the same way you would see it in Russia.
With Georgia under pressure for weeks now, there is concern in neighboring Lithuania about the impact of Russian influence and how it is spreading. We caught up with Cipher Brief expert and former senior CIA officer Ralph Goff on the ground in Vilnius for an update. You know, there's a lot going on in the region where you are right now. Things are not going so well in Georgia when it comes to Russian influence there. What's the sentiment in Lithuania, Ralph? I know that you have been covering this particular issue quite closely. Are they concerned about what's happening in Georgia and the broader threat of Russian influence?
Suzanne, yes, absolutely. Look, Lithuania, during the Soviet era, you had the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and they were very different from the rest of the Soviet Union. I remember coming here in the late 80s, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, in the early part of my career, and there was a completely different vibe here, right? It was Soviet, but it wasn't. And the people here were different, and then you looked at like the maps, all the official maps in the United States, they all said that they had a little asterisk next to the Baltic republics that said, the U.S. government has never recognized the annexation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union, right? And yeah, okay, that was nice to say, but then there was nothing behind it. And so now Lithuania is looking at what's happening in Georgia, they're looking at what's happening in Ukraine, they're looking at what's happened in Moldova, Romania, and they're wondering, okay, so if these countries fall, are they going to be another asterisk on the map in the United States, right? We don't recognize their annexation, but nothing we can do about it. So yes, there's great concern here about events in all those countries.
Mm-hmm. And particularly also, Ukraine, Lithuania has been very involved in trying to help gather intelligence, support Ukraine in their effort. How would you describe the nature of that intelligence relationship these days? We're now approaching almost 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. It's hard to believe.
So look, the Baltic states, all three of them, Lithuania is a country of about 3 million people, right? Just under 3 million people, 2.9, something like that. They have met their spending requirements for NATO. They spend like 2.5%. They're aiming for 3%, 4%, and the government's even talking about shooting for 5%. And by the way, a new government was named like 2 days ago, so there's a lot of flux here in Lithuania. But the one content has been support, not just for NATO, but support for Ukraine. Here, one of the things I noticed on the buses for mass transit, on the front, you have the electric sign that says where the bus is going, and it flips over, and it alternates with Vilnius loves Ukraine, right? And I tell you, I've seen as many flags, Ukrainian flags around the city here as I've seen in Kiev, right? So there's a great amount of sympathy for Ukraine, and not just because it's another victim of Russian oppression, and the Baltics fear that, but also because the lessons of history, and they look back and they remember that asterisk on the maps from the United States. So this is a country that is very very sensitive to what's happening next door, and being a frontline state, this country, not only have they met the expense requirements of NATO, and they got President Trump's approval. They've already reached out to the President-elect Trump's government, and he's kind of like said, "Oh yeah, you guys are okay. You've met the GDP expenditure requirements." But they're trying to go beyond that, and they've also literally stripped their military warehouses to send everything they can to the front in Ukraine, and I think they're somewhat frustrated by the fact that they're a small country, they're leading the way. Where's the rest of Europe?
Yep. I think that's an aspect that's often overlooked in the headlines, particularly the headlines emanating from the United States and Western press, Ralph, is just how much Lithuania has given to support the war in Ukraine. I'm glad you brought up the Trump administration, because I want to ask you what the sentiment is there. They've been partners with the U.S. through one Trump administration. What are they expecting, or what are they hoping for from the next one?
Yeah, that's a great question. And naturally, that was like, after how are you doing? That was usually the second question. So what do we expect from these guys? I give the Lithuanians credit. They're approaching this with an open mind. I know from the people I've talked to that for months before the election even, they were reaching out to people in Trump's circle to try and get a feel for where this was headed. And, now you have the visit in the United States. Andrei Yermak, Ukrainian President Zelensky's close advisor, was in the States this week. And Ukrainians are following that all closely. But I also give them credit for having an open mind. No one here has hit the panic button, right? They look at President Trump, and they they agreed with his criticism of NATO. They agreed with his criticism of countries like Germany who weren't meeting the expenditure requirements, right? So they're very pragmatic. And basically their only question is, okay, we have a new administration, a new approach. Let's see where this goes, right? And not once have I heard anyone here complain or say that, what's wrong with America, what's wrong with this. They've been very pragmatic in their approach, very open-minded.
I think it would be fair to say that if there's confusion about what the next Trump administration might bring, it all kind of boils down to that relationship between Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin. I have to ask you, if the President-elect Trump does make good on his promise and bring about a negotiated settlement to the war in Ukraine,
Right.
what would Vilnius most want to see included in any kind of agreement so that they know they have future protections?
Right. So, along with this pragmatism that they look at with a new administration, their expectations are actually kind of low, right? They're critical of the Zelensky government. They're critical of events in Ukraine, right? But at the same time, they look at it as from the viewpoint of, okay, what's next? If Ukraine falls, right, are we next? And there's a lot of people in the West who say, no, this is just panic mongering. This is just, irrational fears. But, when you spent 70 years as an asterisk on the maps of the, United States, I think you've earned the right to have a little bit of skepticism, right? And so, this is a country that in World War II was squeezed between Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union. And so, they've learned that you can't just take things at face value. You've got to have not just, diplomatic agreements or like the Budapest Agreement that the Ukrainians are so fond of complaining about, but you've got to have real guarantees. And they're realists. They understand that maybe Ukraine membership in NATO is a tough ask, and maybe not in the cards now. But they are absolutely interested in seeing some kind of strategic security architecture that protects Ukraine from a renewed Russian assault if there is some sort of peace agreement. Because
Right.
they look at themselves as next on the menu, right?
Exactly.
One thing I've heard from all sides here is like, hey, if Ukraine falls, and Putin is emboldened, it's not just some kind of cliche metaphor that he's going to turn his attention to the Baltics. They look at his past announcements, his past speeches, where he's claimed that Ukraine isn't a real country, it's really part of Russia. He's said the same thing about the Baltic states.
And finally, a sneak peek at this week's dead drop. Now, for those familiar with espionage and tradecraft, you already know that a dead drop is a location to secretly pass information without a face-to-face meeting. Well, subscribers can pick up a full dead drop report each week at thecipherbrief.com, but I wanted to give you a sneak peek at this week's drop. The FBI is investigating reports of mysterious nighttime drone flights across central New Jersey. Adding to the concern is that these rather peculiar vehicles were spotted near President-elect Trump's Bedminster golf course. NBC had video of local authorities launching their own drones to try to track down these car-sized objects. U.S. Representative Jeff Van Drew told Fox News that the drones were coming from an Iranian mothership off the East Coast. Well, according to NBC, Pentagon officials quickly sank the mothership theory, with spokesperson Sabrina Singh saying there is no Iranian ship off the coast of the United States, and there's no so-called mothership launching drones toward the United States. So far, though, officials have not been able to determine where these drones are coming from. Now, New Jersey is no stranger to reports of odd aerial sightings, though. Back in 1938, a radio drama narrated by Orson Welles set off panic with a tale of aliens landing on a farm in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. That one turned out to be science fiction. All right, that's it for this episode of The World Deciphered. If you're looking for deeply experienced reporting and analysis on national and global security issues, I do hope you'll join us every day of the week at thecipherbrief.com. I also encourage you to stay up to speed on what's happening in the world on a 24-hour basis by reading the Cipher Brief's open source report. We not only tell you what's happened, but we bring you the expert perspective needed to help put it into context. I'm Suzanne Kelly. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time right here on The World Deciphered.